Good morning. Today is March the 13th of the year 2023. This morning we have a lot of things to talk about, so I'm hurrying through this intro because we just have so much. It's jam-packed today, Pastor Eugene, with a lot of goods. So today, under the title of Sunday Funday, we'll be talking about the Sabbath this morning, Pastor Eugene, along with a Q&A and current events. So we got a lot of things to cover. So Brian, please roll the intro, please, if you please. Welcome to the Dear Church podcast, where we exist to fill your ears and your minds with the study of God to see the world as disciples of Christ. My name is Sam Yang, and we have with us Pastor Eugene and Chinsuk this Monday morning, this fun Monday morning. Quickly, Pastor Eugene, this is a fun question that I wanted to start with, just to kind of warm us up a little bit. Pastor Eugene, if you had to pick 5 books for the Christian to read outside of the Bible this year, this is a fun question. 5 books for every Christian to read in the year 2023, what would those 5 books be?
What about you? What have you been reading?
I'm going to read this book called Parenting in the Pew.
Oh, okay.
By Robbie Castleman. This is actually...
You're asking.
Huh?
I knew there was a reason why you're asking.
No, I actually wasn't going to say that at all. But yeah, this is the book that actually St. Andrew's Church, R.C. Sproul's church, I guess his old church, recommends to their parents as they transition their kids from nursery into the main worship. Did you know that St. Andrew's actually only has nursery up to age 2? Then they have this thing called tender care from age 3 to 4. And then from age 4, they're just in the main sanctuary with the parents for worship every Sunday.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
There's one by Dale Partridge. I follow him online. But it's called Jesus and Gender. It's a children's book. And I think that's a good read for parents with young kids. It goes through roles. And so even it got hate from a bunch of places, but because they're like, why are you going through roles? Why can't you just stay on, I'm a boy, I'm a girl.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important to know what the biblical roles are. And to go beyond that might be, somehow it gets displayed in culture. Because every culture has its display of roles. And to say we just want to stay general, don't stay specific, I think is dangerous. I think it's wrong. And the fact that Dale Partridge goes through it is something that I appreciate. And so I would recommend that one if you're into children's books. And I did recommend a book last time for...
the war one?
The fiction, yeah, by Stephen Prentice, but that's one. I have been reading a lot of non-theological books. I don't know. I bought the memoirs of Richard Nixon. It's a really thick book. I don't think anybody's going to really read that. But I would say some of the really interesting books that I have on my shelf to read are books like... that one. And what's the other one that I have? I can't think of it off the top of my head. About Face.
About Face.
Yeah, it's by Hackworth. I think that's what his name is. It's another war book. So we do have books on our bookshelf that we are recommending. And so, definitely think some classics by Puritans are good. I personally really like Jonathan Edwards on revival, if you really want to know what revival is.
Yeah.
And so I've read that. Sola Scriptura is one that Jansuki recommended a while back, and that is an excellent book by multiple authors that we even gave one book away, for Sola Scriptura book away during our members meeting.
Yeah.
Spiritual Disciplines is something that I really enjoy too, by Whitney. That's something that Pastor Paul really liked. So I enjoy that. A non-theological and non-golf book that I enjoy. Oh, I'm sorry.
Not golf book?
Non-war book that I enjoyed is a golf book called Golf is Not a Game of Perfect. I enjoyed that a lot. If you really want a systematic book, Systematic Theology by Hodge is good.
A.A. Hodge. A.A. Hodge. Right? Not to be mistaken with other Hodges.
By Charles Hodge, but sure.
Was it actually Charles?
Yeah.
It's not AA?
No.
That's the person, though.
Yeah.
Okay.
And one thing with social events, Christian nationalism by Stephen Wolfe has gotten a lot of attention. So if you want to read that, uh, um, a medium classic, but it's more modern read that you could do on theology is something that I really like is The Consequence of Ideas by R.C. Sproul. So if you want to read all these, that's great. If you want to read an old book on government, Lex Rex is classic. I think it's a must read for anybody that really is into philosophy, government, politics, and Christianity, how all those come in line. And so those are some of the books that I like. Some really easy books to read that I think would be nice, like a Puritan book is something that I think I mentioned, The Glory of Christ by John Owen.
John Owen.
Yeah, that's a really great book to read. And the one other one by John Owen, which is even easier, just is short excerpts with a bunch of questions that you could go through, is The Duties of Christian Fellowship, also by Owen. And one thing that our praise team has been going over and just finished is Enjoying God by R.C. Sproul.
Yep.
If you want to know about leadership, 3D Leadership by
Harry Reeder.
Harry Reeder is a decent book to read. And if you want to know about creeds, The Need for Creeds is something that we mentioned in the past by Fesco, J.V. Fesco. And so those are all books that you can read that I would highly recommend. And if you want to really light read, we also mentioned Even Exile. Right?
Yep.
That's something that you also put up in the recommended bookshelf by Rebecca Merkel. Great book on talking about restoring femininity. And it talks about the feminist movements as well. It's a great book that you could read or you could pick up if you want to know about that.
Yeah, thank you for all those recommendations. I think, again, if you would like recommendations on books, check out any of the books that Pastor Eugene just mentioned. And also, he mentioned this before too, but we have a recommended books of the quarter that is up on the wall next to the elevator of our church building. And so make sure to check that out as well. We have books there with little excerpts of what they're about. And so you can kind of get a little summary of what each book is about before you make a decision to purchase or borrow from our library, because we have a copy of each book in our library as well.
Yeah, we've recommended so many books over the course of the podcast.
Yeah.
I'm recalling them as I'm saying this to you now, even like devotional books, like Tozer's Trinity devotional book. We've recommended a ton, but this is just a nice little compilation that you can go through.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on to our main bread and butter for this morning, I wanted to talk about the Sabbath. And I know that we have an episode on the Sabbath in our podcast, and it's titled The Eternal Father's Day. And we have talked about this, and we've also talked about the fourth commandment when we were going over the 10 commandments as a series a couple of months back. And so we have those episodes available, but I wanted to continue this conversation because right now, as our church is going through the larger catechism on Sunday morning, we came across larger catechism question number 119. And yesterday, we also went over 120 as well. But I wanted to read 119 for us, and perhaps we could have a discussion on how Christians are to apply the Sabbath and the Sabbath rest. The question is, what are the sins forbidden in the fourth commandment? And the answer is the fourth commandment forbids failing to do anything required by the commandment, or doing it carelessly, negligently, or in such a way as not to benefit from it, and being tired of keeping it. Also, treating the day as unholy by loafing, by doing anything in itself sinful, and by all useless works, words, and thoughts about our worldly affairs and recreations. So there's a couple thoughts here. But before we move on, I wanted to read an excerpt from G.I. Williamson. And G.I. Williamson is someone has written multiple commentaries on the Westminster Shorter Catechism and the Larger Catechism. And I wanted to just read this for us because, and I'll ask the question why. But the question is it possible for heads of families to be too strict in requiring Sabbath observance. It is possible, of course, to be unreasonably strict about the manner of observing the Sabbath. However, it seems probable that in our own time, such extreme strictness is very rare. The tendency today is just the opposite, in the direction of toleration, of carelessness, and disregard for the sanctity of the Sabbath. It would be well if there were a greater degree of strictness about Sabbath observance today. Of course, some allowance must be made for little children. They cannot be expected to observe the Sabbath in exactly the way adults should. Yet, even young children should be made to realize that there is a difference between the Sabbath and other days, and that activities which are proper on ordinary days are wrong on the Sabbath. And he actually goes on to talk about what things should be excluded from family life on the Sabbath. For example, he says that studying day school lessons, reading ordinary books and magazines, reading newspapers, listening to radio broadcasts of any kind, playing ordinary games, whether indoors or outdoors, writing ordinary letters to friends or relatives or other persons, conversations about financial or business matters, ordinary social visiting, common picnicking, attending public amusements or athletic events of whatever type. But he does say that you could listen to, Orthodox religious broadcasts. So this is very countercultural. We don't do this today. We gather on Sundays oftentimes to even watch football. We play sports together. We do, X, Y, and Z. We do a lot of different things. And Sunday is just kind of the day that we have seen in our world where we just kind of rest from work and do everything else. So what are your thoughts on this G.I. Williamson interpretation as well? And what is forbidden and encouraged by the fourth commandment?
Yeah, I think a lot of people have different views on the Sabbath. Some people have a progressive view. Some people have a static view. Some people have split it up between two main views that reformers have taken, which is either Puritan or Continental, which we can get to. But I think it all stems from our understanding of what God meant when he said, Sabbath day you will keep holy. What does that exactly mean? And so he does qualify it in Exodus chapter 20. I think we should read that. And I think we should also read, to the side of it, Isaiah 58, especially verses 13 and 14.
This is Exodus chapter 20, verse 8 to 11. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. This is Isaiah 58, chapter 58, verse 13 to 14. If you turn your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, and the holy day of the Lord honorable, if you honor it, not going your own ways, or seeking your own pleasure, or talking idly, then you shall take delight in the Lord. And I will make you ride on the heights of the earth. I will feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken.
Yeah, and so what is going on in Isaiah 58 is people are saying they're keeping the Sabbath, and he's like, "No, you're not. You didn't. You're like even oppressing people on this day, and this is not something that I will commend or I will even think is honorable to me." And then in the end, it goes to these last two verses that you read. So I think the spirit of us wanting to keep the Sabbath, this is something that should be, I don't know, kind of an umbrella understanding. All the views that we have, whether we might differ slightly, whether it's the Puritan or Continental view, whether it's the G.I. Williamson one that you're talking about, which it seems more is toward the Puritan view, is that is the Sabbath for you? If the Sabbath is for you, that's not the Sabbath. That's something that God speaks out against. So what is the Sabbath for? And so what is it meant to do? What does God want from us during the Sabbath? And so a lot of times people have taken it as, well, let's go with this first. It's not a day for your pleasure. So you know how in the secular world we see the weekend as a me thing. You know,
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
time for the weekend. It's time for me to do
yeah.
me things because during the week I can't do me things. God flips that kind of thinking and turns it over on its head because he's saying throughout the whole week, you just do you things. You have to at least set aside a day, one day, the Sabbath day, to do only God things then. You know what I mean? And so, how do we differentiate? So, that's where the debate is. How do we differentiate what is a me thing and what is only a God thing? Because aren't we supposed to glorify God in our bodies all the day, meaning 24/7? Aren't we supposed to do that? And so, what does that mean? And so, a lot of reformers have taken it to mean that it should be a special, separate, consecrated, holy day in which we purposefully give God honor and glory in a, you know, in that kind of pointed way. Does that make sense?
So I'm curious. You talked about Isaiah 58, and here it seems like it does give specific ways that we are to honor the Sabbath. Not seeking our own pleasure, like you just talked about,
Hmm.
not talking idly, which I think is interesting.
Hmm.
Um, not going our own way. Then you shall take delight in the Lord. And I think you make a great point in the debate being distinguishing between what is holy and not. So, in the Exodus text, we know that we are to keep the Sabbath day holy. So, I guess how do we practice this? And the reason why I also ask this is because I think when I first saw this G.I. Williamson text, my first response was, this is a little too radical. And then I kind of had to backtrack a little bit. Am I thinking this is too radical because it is radical? Or am I thinking it's radical because I'm so bought into the worldly idea that Sunday is for me, Sunday is for rest, Sunday is for laying on the couch and watching football, that reading something like this, it makes me defensive. And so I don't know how to differentiate between the two right now.
I think that's the case for a lot of people. Unfortunately, maybe even in our church, we haven't gone over Sabbath well enough on a more regular basis. I mean, we've done one podcast on it, but is it a day? I think the question that you should ask yourself is it a day where you get to finally finish up the chores that you weren't able to do for the rest of the week? I
Hmm.
didn't go shopping, so today is a day for shopping.
Right, right,
And if
right.
that's the case, I think you are in the wrong. I think, that is a very bad place to be in because the Sabbath isn't a day where you get to finish up the chores that, you fail to do throughout the rest of the week. It's not a day where you can say, "Oh, I had a project due. At least I have Sunday now to finish it." So that's not what the Sabbath is there for. Sabbath is there to delight in God, to dedicate that day to God, to further our sanctification in the way God commands, so in the way God regulates. And so, one of the things that I would say is, yeah, for our day and age, to start from the small, it'll get better. But start from the small. It's not a day for you. It's not a day where you can have, family outings and, let's finally go on this park trip that we've always wanted to go to on a Sunday. In fact, it's supposed to be a day that you set aside, that you set apart. It's a day that you call holy so that you can turn entirely to God.
So, what does that look like in our context today? Does that mean no video games? Does that mean no football? And you even brought up grocery shopping, right? Or doing house errands. What I find is that, just like you said, oftentimes people will finish up their house errands on Sunday. But if you even look at Jewish culture, they would never do that. They weren't even allowed to pick up manna on Sunday. I mean, why are we picking up groceries on Sunday? Is that
So what
wrong?
did they? Yeah. So instead of something that they were prohibited to do, remember there is a negative reinforcement to show the positive
Right.
reinforcement. So this is a positive reinforcement, but there are negative reinforcements attached to it. Don't do
Hmm.
these things
Hmm.
because you ought to do this.
Right.
And so, what is it that you are to do so that you're not just sitting on your butt? So, yeah, there are chores to be done. you're not going to do it because you want to keep the Sabbath holy. But does that mean you could just sit at home on the couch and just watch TV and football? Is that what it is? And I
Right.
think the answer is no to that as well.
Hmm.
So what is the positive, or what is the, what do you need to initiate? What do you need to affirm? What do you need to like go out and do
Mm.
on the Sabbath? And it is, I think, a special worship to God. It is setting aside time to learn in a more concentrated and a deeper manner His word. It is a set time where the saints can come together to sing His praises, to worship God. And this is why I really do enjoy where a lot of churches have not just a morning service, they have an evening service, and
Yeah.
that's Sunday service. Sunday service isn't just one service, but you and I grew up in a culture where Sunday service just means morning.
Yep.
And then in
Yep.
the afternoon, it's, I don't know, events or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But throughout history, people believe that, if you want to keep the Sabbath, it's a day. This goes beyond New Testament times, it goes all the way back. Again, I want to say this with the caveat that this is debated. Even Augustine
Mm.
had his own views on the Sabbath, where he might have even gone as far as to say, of the Ten Commandments, what we're to keep is the moral law. The Sabbath isn't a moral law. So, in that sense, it could be an abrogation that is
Mm.
acceptable. Obviously, the Puritans don't agree with that part,
No.
and a lot of the reformers do not agree with that.
Mm.
And so, what does it mean that the Sabbath is something to be kept holy? And again, Jesus is the one that qualifies the Sabbath too. When the disciples were picking grain on the Sabbath, and he was criticized by the Pharisees,
Yeah.
why are your disciples doing something that is unlawful?
Yeah.
And so Jesus corrects them what Sabbath was made for. So Sabbath was made for the person to be edified,
Mm.
and specifically to be edified in God. And so the disciples were with Jesus. They were hungry, so they were fed. And I think that pointed to uh, a lot of the understanding we should have about the Sabbath. The Sabbath is where we are fed by Jesus. And so, how does that happen? I think that happens when you read the Word of God, study the Word of God, and there is a special time where you will concentrate, especially put your energy and focus and passion into this study, not just by yourself, but with the community, with the saints. And I think that happens on the Sabbath.
So I know that we know the principle, or I would hope that we would understand the principle of what the Sabbath is and what rest is versus work and what it all points to. And I know you're going to go over this in the book of Hebrews as well. But I'm wondering, for the listener listening to this, because that's what listeners do, they listen. For someone that's listening to this, what is this? How do I apply this? Does this mean that I can no longer do laundry on Sunday? Does this mean that, I no longer can play video games and watch football? What does this mean? Are we being too loose with our understanding of the Sabbath? Because, like you said, Puritans, even John Calvin wouldn't even go lawn bowling on Sunday. Whatever that is, because it's a popular sport, I guess, back in that time, but they wouldn't even do recreation on Sunday. And so then for our church, people in our congregation, what do we do? What don't we do? And I'm not asking for an extensive list, but how can we think through what we should and should not be doing on the Lord's Day?
I think what you read in the Westminster Larger Catechism is really good. And I think when we focus the Sabbath on worship, it is a wonderful thing. And when we focus on worship, there's also something else that happens. There's fellowship that happens in the saints. Um, I don't know if we find a very strict prohibition on all recreation. I think that recreation that is mentioned can be interpreted like John Knox also interpreted it that way, but where it is kind of more self-serving recreation. And, Calvin also didn't prohibit all recreation. The Puritans were kind of extreme on that. And so, for good reason, they really wanted to honor God with every single fiber of their being. But you see, the Puritans, what was the outgrowth of all that? they had amazing works. They're like treasure in our hands now when we read Puritan works. And so I think there was a fruit that is beneficial, that has been beneficial to the church. And so um, I would say if you focus on worship, then there's a lot of things that goes on. You can have corporate worship, you can have family worship, you could have community gatherings that will center around worship, even smaller breakups of the larger church that would gather. And so, things like that we are kind of trying to do with even larger groups on the third Sunday of every month, where you come together and you reflect on the word, you have fellowship. Basically what it is you're worshiping God continually. And so that's what we want to continue to do. Now, if you want to ask about exactly what you can and cannot do and have a list, I don't think you'd find anything outside of those really black and white lists. And so I think that's one of the more difficult things about observing the Sabbath. When we do too much, it becomes more Pharisaic, and then we forget that Sabbath was made for man. And and when we do too little, then we don't observe the Lord's day. It's really about me. So made for man isn't like a me day. Obviously, made for man means to be edified in God. And so that's what I hope that we can think of when we think about being edified during the Sabbath. And so, should you work on the Sabbath? I think R.C. Sproul also goes into minus the essential.
Like the emergency services, right?
Yeah. He would say it is prohibited. And I tend to agree with that. So unless you're a hospital worker that needs to work, you should close your business, um, and things like that. So unless you're an essential worker, meaning if you don't work on this day, then basically the community will be in chaos. So you don't want that to happen. But take it. Yeah, I'm sure people can have pushback these days on anything.
So I want to keep on prodding because I'm uncomfortable. And I think me being uncomfortable is a good thing. Because I think for me, even as we discuss this, I'm trying to figure out which of my views is so world influenced that I'm uncomfortable, versus, like trying to really understand what the Bible says about Sabbath and rest. So, I mean, we know that work isn't just your career. The world interprets it that way, where we have the weekend, right? We have Saturday, Sunday, where we don't go to work, where we don't log into our online work portal or whatever it might be, for those that work at home. But we know that work is anything that's not rest, right? So, like we talked about, laundry, grocery shopping, doing, I mean, even maybe doing the dishes, cooking. I mean, the Jews weren't allowed to do that back in the day. So how do we interpret that today, where we are not to work on Sunday? Does that mean that we can't do those things? I mean, and I really did enjoy what you said about, well, what does it say about the other 6 days? Because like you said, on Saturday, actually, or rather on Friday for the Jews, they were supposed to gather twice as much so that they would not have to work on Saturday. So they had to plan ahead, and they have to collect twice as much the day prior and do all the work prior so that they can rest on the Sabbath. And so, does this mean that we should be doing all of our laundry throughout the week and not on Sunday? What does work look like? Because it doesn't always talk about our career, right? That's not what work is.
Yeah. I think the spirit of the Sabbath is really important for us to remember. I'll just read you a quote by what John Knox he wrote. Remember, John Knox is the one that visited John Calvin, and he was shocked that Calvin would be like lawn bowling. And so this is what Knox wrote in 1560 in a document. Part of the original Confession of Faith. But this is what he says: to have one God, to worship and honor him, to call upon him in all our troubles, to reverence his holy name, to hear his word, to believe the same, to communicate with his holy sacraments are the works of the first table. And so this is what he was trying to get at. On the Sabbath, you commemorate the first table. And so what does that mean? And I think that's what all Christians really are aiming to do. It's to worship God as fully as possible, not as minimally as possible, but as fully as possible. To have all these things, all these elements that Knox mentions in that worship of God, and I think that happens in the corporate service. And I think that happens even post corporate service. So let's say you're in a church and you start service at 10 a.m. and you end around 11:30 a.m. There's a short fellowship after with maybe food, maybe not food, whatever the case is. You participate in that. You encourage the saints. You edify each other. You share about how you can pray with one another. All these things happen. And I think that is Christ honoring. I think that is adhering to the Sabbath and the spirit of what the Sabbath was meant to do. And so, in that sense, I think that is kind of keeping to the first table, understanding that John Knox was trying to get to. Now, there were other people who during this time would, see, oh, how long can I work until? Can I work until, sunset,
Mm.
sunrise?
Right, right,
Because
right.
let's say you're a tailor, let's say you're sewing or knitting and things like that. Can I do it right up until the Sunday service?
Yeah.
Or is it when sunrise happens? And so all these things were all questioned. People asked all these detailed questions like you are wondering now. And so that's why if you don't have the spirit, then all this minutia gets to you because we tend to wonder about how pragmatically
Mm,
these things will play out.
mm.
But if it's, what I'm trying to get at is if you don't have the spirit, then the pragmatics and even the details don't matter. If you don't have the spirit, then what's the point of telling your kid that we're setting aside this time to go to church? Because, 10 minutes before church, you're just doing everything that is not holy.
Yeah,
You know
yeah,
what I mean?
yeah.
And then your kid sees that and says, you're all a bunch of hypocrites,
Mm.
that kind of thing. And so I think in our podcast too on the Eternal Father's Day, we were talking about everything is centered around the Sabbath. So you lead up to the Sabbath, you go forth from the Sabbath. And I think that's something that I want to reiterate. Um, from the Sabbath starts the rest of the week. And that's what we want to do. We want to make sure that we start at the highest place possible in our giving and our worshiping so that the rest of the week can follow through from that spirit. And so on Sunday, I would say do everything that you possibly can to honor the Sabbath, to honor the holy day, to give God worship, to focus on Him, to meditate on Him. And then the rest of the week will follow.
So I'm just one, maybe just two more specifics. I know we don't really necessarily always talk specifics. We talk general principles. So I'll just ask the general principle in a second. But what about uh, going to a restaurant on Sunday or going to a business that is open on Sunday? I know that in Bergen County, we have the blue laws. And actually, that used to be a thing, I think, across the United States. That's not really there anymore. But what about, visiting businesses that are open on Sunday? Because then by visiting them, we are therefore supporting people working on Sunday. And I get it that the people that are open may not be Christian, that they might be non-believers. And so, what does a non-believer have to do with honoring the Sabbath? But don't Christians even press and protest for laws to be passed that are Christian so that the world or the country can be God-fearing? That even if they're not a Christian, they would go against Christian, they would go and live with Christian principles and morals according to the law. And so don't we push for legislation that promotes Christian living? Shouldn't we do the same thing then with visiting restaurants or dry cleaners or grocery stores on Sunday?
Yeah, it would be great if an entire community was all Christian or adhered to the Sabbath and everything was closed. And then we just had people worshiping. I don't know, that
Yeah.
would be great.
Yeah.
However, we don't live in that kind of society. We live in a pluralistic society, and that's reality. And so when you try to, so this has been done in the past where people have tried to enforce Sabbatarian laws
Yeah.
in the commonplace in the secular world, and people will be jailed for being a doctor, doing doctor stuff, right?
Mm.
And so we have records of that. And that was, I think, poor in judgment to do things like that. And so when you think about restaurants, take it to the extreme. First of all, do you want everybody to close down their doors? And if you say no, then who should stay open? Do you get to dictate that? Do you get to go through each detail saying this door is worthy to open, this door is worthy to close? Or is it that you will go by your conscience and you will adhere to, let's say, your elders in your local church in that observance? Because I think that is much more, um, I don't know, safer instead of going through, let's jail people who go to restaurants. Now, to answer your other part of the question is, can we now patronize these businesses
Yeah.
if they're not Christian? If they're a part of your church, would you patronize them? And the answer is, that's a difficult question for me to answer. If they're a part of my church, they're not coming to service, and they're opening up a business instead, would I patronize that business? And the answer is, I think the answer is pretty obvious. Anybody that knows me knows that I wouldn't. I would encourage them rather to close their doors and come out to church. But a lot of people say, I could barely make ends meet and I need to open up on Sundays. You don't understand. And I feel bad for them, because even if you need to open on Sundays to make ends meet, then you're probably not going to make it, to
Mm.
be honest. You're just going to kind of go by until. And so, the questions would be then, what's the end date? Do you have a set time until when you're going to do this? Because you do want to attend Sunday service. It's
Mm.
very important to you. And if this is a short stint, when is your threshold? What is your threshold? Those are all questions I will probably ask in ministry. And so if it's part of our church, it's very different than someone who does not believe, that doesn't go to church, and is just opening up their doors by you patronizing their business. I think those are different things. I personally have no problem going to a restaurant and eating on Sunday. I know that some people may, so some people might not, and they would have a house that they could open and to have all the people come to their house and eat. That would be great. The fact that we do the restaurant stuff is because we don't have, that capacity to maybe open up a house every Sunday and serve them meals. But we try, to do that with, let's say, a larger group or whatever it is on a Sunday. So in the end, it still goes back down to spirit. It goes back down to the heart, what your goal and purpose is. Are you honoring God, or are you just honoring yourself? And so if you think about those things, then I think those actions will be more purposeful rather than just, handling Sunday like a Monday or Tuesday or Saturday or something to that effect.
One more specific before we go general. What about drinking on Sunday? A lot of times, Christians and non-Christians alike will drink.
You mean like communion?
No, this is the unholy. Yeah, they'll just have beers together. They'll drink together, whether they're watching a football game or basketball game or just even meeting together. It seems like in America, whenever you meet, there is alcohol involved. What about drinking? Because if we are supposed to keep this day holy, I think a part of holiness is being sober-minded. Granted that not everyone that drinks is getting drunk, right? But there is some sort of looseness that comes with drinking, even when you're not drunk. And so my question is drinking then, should that be prohibited? Because you are really maybe even going against the call to be holy on the Lord's day.
Yeah, I think there's a difference between what I personally put on myself and what I would, bind your consciences with.
Mm.
And so personally, I don't drink. Even on the Sabbath, I won't drink. Right?
Mm.
I don't think it's beneficial. This is personally speaking. I don't think drinking is beneficial ever. There's no positives to me. This is personal. To me, even drinking one beer, there's no health benefit. It doesn't
No.
relax me.
No,
There's nothing. Alcohol is a poison. That's a fact. And
Mhm.
so whether you put in just a small amount of poison or a large amount, it's just useless to me.
Yeah.
Now people want to drink it to get loose. They have this whole regimen of when they drink a nice ice cold beer, it really refreshes their body, so their soul feels refreshed and that kind
Oh
of
yeah.
thing. Um, and so, on Sundays, we are called to, in the very least, not be refreshed by
Bud Light.
artificial means.
Yeah.
Yeah. So be refreshed in the word
Yeah.
is what I would say. Again, the binding of the conscience is something that I would stay away from unless it's explicitly said in the word. But yeah, doing any kind of revelry with alcohol is not something that I would ever endorse. And so, even when you guys go out to have drinks on, let's say, a weekday, I
What do you
don't
mean you
really like
guys?
that either.
I mean us.
Yeah, meaning you, Sam. I don't really like that either. And I get it that people are like, well, what if it's like, monitored and we keep responsible? It's like, well, yeah, guess why you have to be monitored? Guess why you
Yeah.
have to be responsible? Because you're in dangerous territory
Yeah.
and you're purposely putting yourself there. And this is a very young people culture.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, if you're 60 and you're doing that, people would automatically assume that you have a problem. Why is it when you're 20, it's not a problem?
Yeah.
And so I find that to be weird about this culture. I don't like it. And so in that sense, I think it's pretty explicit not to go into drunken revelry.
Mm.
And so that's kind of stupid. What if you just drink a beer? Well, I mean, is it the culture that you're in where people will get drunk? Then yeah, it's stupid to even drink a beer in a place where people get drunk. I don't get
Mm.
it.
Mm.
So that's something that I don't like. And so when you bring it to the Sabbath, it's just, I mean, it's pretty evident to me. Why would you do that on the Sabbath when
Mm.
you're trying to focus on holy actions of worship
Yeah.
and things like that?
Yeah. People are not gonna like me after this one.
Yeah, because
No,
you
not me.
you
I'm just
go
saying.
into the drunken revelry.
No, I'm just asking these questions because I think G.I. Williamson, in my humble opinion, is correct in that more often than not, we take this command more loosely than anything else. We just kind of rest in the world we rest in the way that the world rests. And so I guess going into the broad, how does Christian rest look different from non-Christian rest? And what are some guidelines that you would give us as our pastor to rest correctly, to honor the Sabbath, to keep it holy? What are some guidelines that you could give us that we can think through as we're thinking, hey, should I do this or should I do that? Some guidelines maybe to help us.
Yeah, there are things that I move toward and things that I'll, maybe just give in and compromise, and things that I won't do at all. But move toward, I think, is the most important thing. What are you moving toward? So if you're moving toward a place of worship, a place of honoring God fully and completely with every fiber of your being, and you're especially focused, like laser focused in on a Sunday, that's, I think, a very good thing. As far as this kind of rest is concerned, it's rest from worldly works. That's what it is. And now what you're going to do is you're going to focus on God and rest in God. And so what does it mean to rest in God? It would be to meditate on Him. It would be to worship Him. And obviously that has works involved. So it's stupid to think it's rest, meaning you just lie in your bed and do nothing.
Yeah.
No one believes that. And so, what does it mean to rest in God? That's what I would probably go to. Now, do I think that in that kind of spirit that I can go visit people in my church and to edify them by just maybe even to the effect of lounging, spending time with their families, reading a book or watching TV with them? I think that's fine.
Mm.
Honestly, I think that's fine because my heart and my spirit is to edify this family with my presence. Maybe we will pray. Maybe we'll talk and discuss about, Bible,
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
like that. And so those are things that happen on a weekly basis. Now, if it's just me and my family centered stuff, that's something that I'll probably stay away from. If you go shopping, if you go food shopping on a Sunday once, is it the end of the world? No, I don't think so. But if you do it on a regular basis and you make it a habit and this is part of your regimen, I think that's wrong.
Like that's your food shopping
Yeah, that's
day.
our food shopping day. I think that's wrong. I think you should be free to do the things that you ought to edify one
Mm,
another,
mm.
to worship God. And so, in that spirit, that means when someone gets hurt, you get to help them. You're not like, oh, this is my regimen.
Right, right, right.
From 3 to 4, I got to do this. From 4 to 5, I got to do this, and
Yeah.
that kind of thing. And so, when someone's hurt, when even your animal gets stuck in a ditch, wouldn't you help it out on the Sabbath? Jesus challenges the Pharisees because they explicitly did things like that, but they
Yep.
wouldn't let him heal on a Sabbath. How
Yep.
much more
Yep.
worth is some life? And so the focus is wrong. When the focus is wrong, and then you got everything wrong. And so when you're asking for specifics, the reason why I don't give like that regimen is because we are people that tend to fall into that kind of um, you know
Legalism.
legalism,
Yeah.
Pharisaism. But I could clearly say some things are wrong. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think sinning is right. So you
Yeah.
shouldn't sin
Yeah.
on a Sunday. I don't think you should purposefully sin. I don't think you should purposefully sin any day, but especially on Sunday. And I wouldn't give myself even an inch of temptation into sinning. That's why I wouldn't drink at all. There's always that one dude who's going to drink like 5 beers when you have a gathering,
Mm.
and you're just like, oh, what is this guy doing? He's ruining it for us. And just get rid of the beers. I don't understand why that's a big thing.
Yeah.
It's not a big thing to me. Why is it such a big thing to you that you have to have beers, and you're just going to look down on the guy who's obviously weak in faith? And read First Corinthians again about the person in weaker faith and how you have to adjust to that person.
Yeah.
And so on Sunday, you wouldn't give any kind of leeway or an opening for Satan to disrupt
Yeah.
what should be set aside as holy. So I think drinking is very clear to me. Don't
Mm.
drink on a Sunday. I
Mm.
think it's just easy.
Mm.
Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. Just have that in your mind, right? And in the end, if there's other things that you want to do, don't sin. Don't give any kind of uh, opportunity for sin to enter into your fellowship. Get that out of there, and make sure it's focused on the worship of God and to the edifying of the saints.
And so I think you were right in that there are very specific things that we are not to do and to do. And there are also things that we are to discern using wisdom. And it's again your conscience as well. But I wanted to read for us Colossians chapter 2, verse 16 to 17. And this has to do with some of what you were saying just now. And it reads, "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in question of food and drink, or with regard to a festival, or a new moon, or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." And so, as we are trying to apply the commandment of the Sabbath into our lives, I think it is important that people are in different places. Granted, there are very, very black and white things in the Bible, like sin and not sin. And yet, like you said, there are certain things that are up for debate, correct?
Yes.
So let us not be the first one to throw the stone. Don't be stoning nobody, and don't get stoned.
Mhm. Stoning is different in the Bible. Can you have a Super Bowl party without drinks? No, why not? I think that's a you problem right there. That's not a me problem. I think you have issues with drinking. Um, just like in any diet, if you can't stop eating something even though you're on a diet, you have a problem. Why can't you set aside this time to make sure it's just fully healthy? And we know drinking is not healthy, spiritually or physically. So
Yeah.
why are you doing this?
No, I think this is good because it gets us to think about the things that we're doing that we just kind of took for granted. So, for example, like even drinking on a Sunday or even just grocery shopping on a Sunday, it makes us think about what we're doing because we're just following the trend and the current of the world, right? Because of course, everyone does this on Sunday, everyone does that on Sunday, but as Christians, our rest should be distinct and different from those that are not Christian.
Yeah, I think. Well, maybe I should try to give a little bit of from the other side. I think a lot of people believe that during festivals, it is a festival because there is drinking.
What kind of festival? Like Izu?
So even in Calvin's time, there was
Oh,
something like things called Sunday festivals, and Calvin
yes,
had no
yes.
problem attending or following
Mm.
Sunday festival activity. I don't think he drank though, but I could be wrong. But can you have fun without alcohol? And if the answer is no, that's weird to me.
Mm,
I think that's a problem. I think
mm,
you have an issue. I think you could have lots of fun without alcohol. And for some reason in the Bible, it's drinking and drunkenness is always juxtaposed or it's contrasted with God's work and the Holy Spirit.
mm.
So I don't get it. Why is it a thing? Now is drinking terrible and is it a sin? No, I didn't say that either. Back in Jesus' time, Jesus drank because that was the only kind of drink that could really last
Mm.
would be this light wine, right? That would last. Sometimes it was really hard to get water. And so there was that mix of, it being in festival activity and it being something that you could drink. And so Jesus actually didn't mind drinking even in festivals. I don't know if he drank at Cana, but he did make wine. So
Wine was bomb though.
yeah, I
They
mean,
won.
you can kind of say he was endorsing it. So in wedding festivals and things like that, I don't see any problem with people drinking. So, I hope that that kind of paints a better picture or more broad picture. I'm not saying we should all be um, teetotalers, like
Yeah,
no drinking ever.
yeah.
I just don't find any benefit to alcohol myself personally, whether
Mm,
it's physical or spiritual. But if I have a drink in front of me and people are like, can we celebrate with a toast and a glass of champagne? I don't have any problem drinking champagne. I might not do it in front of some people who have problems with me
mm,
having
mm.
a drink. Like, we grew up in the Korean church. So a
Yeah.
lot of older Korean people have problems with any kind of alcohol association with a pastor or a pastor associated with alcohol. So, for their sake, because they're the weaker Christian, I'll do that. I won't drink. But otherwise, I have a drink of choice that I would go to if I could drink. Anyway, and so see, all these things if we start to get into the minutia of everything, it can get very convoluted. It can get very confusing. In the end, what is the spirit? And if you decide as a community, we're not going to do this, I think we should adhere to it. But right now in our church, we have not said anything. And I think there's good reason for that. I think there's a lot of weak people who don't know how to differentiate between actual fellowship and drinking fellowship. And so those are things where, we're trying to teach slowly, but perhaps more clearly as time goes on about where drinking would stay. And
Yeah.
this is not a podcast on drinking, so
No,
we won't go too far.
not the drinking podcast.
Yeah.
Um,
We should have a podcast where we take a shot
of water.
every time
No, thank you.
you
This
say
is not.
something
Oh, Power Hour.
silly.
That's a game that they play.
Who's they?
The pagans. Um, on the same theme of sabbatical. Sorry, on the same theme of Sabbath. You mentioned 2 Sundays ago at our members meeting that our two elders are on a sabbatical. So on the theme of Sabbath, what is a sabbatical? What does that look like for elders? What does that look like for deacons? And will you go on a sabbatical?
I don't know if I will. Depends on where the state of our church is. And I think that's a really good question. I think the whole idea of Sabbath and taking a sabbatical, that spirit should still be there. So a lot of people think when I go on a sabbatical, even pastors, this for me. It's solely for me. I think there's a problem with that kind of thinking as well. If you're resting up so that you could come back more on fire, that you can serve the church better, that's a good idea of a Sabbath or a sabbatical. And I think that's one of the things. Another thing that we do is we force a sabbatical on elders who have served 6 years, and then we have them re-up, meaning we vote for them again.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing for an elder to take a Sabbath so that the church also sees, oh, this is someone I need to pray for. This is someone that needs rest. This is something that I can come alongside with as they take their sabbatical. And then there's also a reaffirmation. Perhaps this elder just didn't cut it for 6 years. He just barely made it by. I mean, that's reality, right? And during the Sabbath, you kind of notice like, oh, actually, he's doing better not being in active duty. And so, yeah, let him take a permanent break then. or even a longer break until he could get back. Or maybe he wasn't fit to be an elder, and so he'll never come back on active service. And so those are all things on the table when an elder takes a sabbatical. But again, if it's just me centered, there's something wrong with that. And if it's God centered and it is other edifying, then the sabbatical is good.
Well, does that mean that they don't serve in any capacity, or when a deacon goes on sabbatical, does that mean they don't do like what does that look like practically? I
Yeah, I
guess.
don't think it means that you don't do any kind of service. It just means you don't have any official responsibility given to you by the church. So you should serve. You should like volunteer.
Mm,
You should do all these things. But it's not like you have let's say for the elder. It's not like the elders actually discouraged sometimes to a degree of prohibition of attending a session meeting. Then so
yeah,
they can just be at home. So they don't have to come and do all the ruling elder work.
gotcha.
Deacons, same thing. They should be able to serve, but they don't come to the deacon meetings and things like that. So
Oh,
that's how we kind of clearly distinguish someone who is an active officer versus someone who is on sabbatical.
gotcha. Because someone might wonder, because you mentioned sabbatical, right? You mentioned our elder Song and Jubin being on sabbatical, and so they might wonder, okay, well, what's the difference? They're still here on Sunday. They're here on Saturday morning during AMP. What are they not
Yeah, it's
doing?
not
What
like
are
you're
they
not a
doing?
Christian anymore.
Right? No, no, no. Of course, but I'm just
Just because
saying.
you're on sabbatical is like, I'm not a Christian. Yeah, they're a brother in Christ. They're a member of the church. Everything a member is expected to do, the elder would do. But in the capacity of, the active elder duties, they would be taking a break from that, which one of them is coming to the session meetings. And the other thing that elders do is they oversee specific ministries. So they wouldn't oversee any specific ministry, but it doesn't mean they can't serve that ministry.
Right, right, right.
So that's a clear distinction we make between elders who are active and elders who are on sabbatical. And
Right.
the same kind of thing would go for deacons.
Uh-huh. Gotcha. Thank you for that. Let's quickly go into a Q&A.
We need a beat.
This is a question from one of our listeners. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Employers require employees to agree to employment policies, including prohibition against discrimination based on gender, etc., and permits self-identified genders, etc. Conversations with colleagues come up about gender, sexual orientation, including in conversations about family, and voicing a contradictory opinion can be viewed as contrary to these policies. Given that reality, how tangibly should we approach these conversations? Of course, we need wisdom, so is it the best course sometimes to stay silent? What does having integrity but also not asking for workplace reprimand look like in these situations?
Let's do a quick alliteration. First, we were called to compromise because that's tolerant. And then there's capitulation. You have to, give up those beliefs and then, accept the other person's beliefs. Now it is a celebration that we are expected to do. You need to celebrate the thing that you had once disagreed with. And that's no different from people in the workplace now, not just in society in general, but even in specific workplaces, they will do that. Because if you don't celebrate, if you don't affirm, and if you don't, not just give in, but to continually, vocally, verbally affirm it over and over again, then you must be a homophobe. And if you're a homophobe, or you're a transphobe, or whatever phobe it is, then you are literally murdering people, unquote, that kind of thing. Um, the workplace, when that happens in the workplace, people have used their discernment and wisdom to whatever degree God has granted them. And I think these days you need to pray for more. Pray to God for more wisdom. Ask God for strength and wisdom for you to carry out what Jesus commanded his disciples, to be as shrewd as serpents and as innocent as doves, right? So you don't want to capitulate. You don't want to give in to the beliefs that you hold that God has given through his word. But at the same time, you don't want to be, that naive person who just kind of gets bumped around. Um, and so I think it looks different from every workplace. It looks different from every situation. However, I will say this, what we are facing now as a nation and as the world isn't just celebration. Now it has gone to my fourth C in the alliteration. It's confession. Now we must have this confession of faith of the LGBTQ agenda.
Mm.
So you need to continue to say things like hashtag trans woman or woman. You better have one of those hashtags in your tweets or replies in your Twitter account. Otherwise, there's suspicion. There's suspicion. It doesn't matter who you are. You could be just, let's say you could have an account now in social media and all you want to do is talk about desserts that you make. Well, you better have something about trans people there because trans people like desserts. And on Trans Day, you better have a trans dessert. I'm serious. That it is now turned to a confession that people have to do on a regular basis. You know who does confessions? Religions. You know who also has confession? Christians have confessions. We have a confession of faith. We have
Yeah.
confessions that we go over. The Westminster Larger Catechism is from the Westminster Confession, right? And so those are things that we have had because this is a religious ideology that we hold on to. Now that we say there are secular ideologies, but they have turned into a religious ideology, meaning the LGBTQ agenda is a religion. They have a confession. And if you don't say the confession, then you are someone that will be cast out of anybody who, and they're taken over. Basically, it is a secular religion, meaning the world needs to adhere to it. And that's where you are. So you're facing this kind of threat, this kind of danger in your workplace. So I don't like it. Obviously, I don't like it. How do we fight against it? We pray for God's mercy. We pray that God would grant repentance to all the people that have capitulated, now celebrated, now is even part of this confessional thing that people are doing. Look at all our Gen Z teachers. They have a confession on their wall. It's either a BLM flag or a pride flag or both.
Yeah.
That's the confession. They have it all. And they're teaching our young kids this. And they're like, oh, what's the big deal? It's because you're adhering to now the confession. It's not just the capitulation or the compromise. Now you have the confession on your walls, in your schoolrooms, in your classrooms.
Yep.
That has gone to the workplaces where even workplaces must have this confession. They have to have a flag up. And so that's where we are. And when you don't do it, then you're an enemy of the state because the state's confession is also the LGBTQ pride flag as well. They put it up on the White House. They put it up through their lighting of, government buildings, in their embassies around the world because it's a confession. And so when you go against it, you will be penalized. You will get persecuted. You will suffer the consequences of going against the secular regime. And so number 2 part is be prepared. You want to be wise as doves. You want to be, wise as serpents and innocent as doves. But you also want to be prepared for the inevitable persecution that comes when you go against the secular regime. And it could be a firing from your job. It could be, a demotion. It could be never getting promoted, whatever the case is. But I hope that you will remember that when we follow God, it's God that we believe is sovereign, that justice will happen. And it's not just a matter of, we'll just suffer, woe is me all the time. God will avenge because vengeance is in his hands, right?
Yeah.
So we trust that God will, in the end, carry out his justice, especially when it comes to something like as abhorrent as this LGBTQ agenda.
I think that's really helpful, especially because a lot of people today are facing this situation. I've even heard of teachers that have to go to mandatory LGBTQ training sessions and how to even handle that. And using pronouns, when you're forced to share your pronouns, how to handle that. And so these are the questions of the modern day. So we thank you for that answer.
Yeah, so it's good to point out what is the God that the secular man serves? It's the self.
Yeah.
And so pronouns, LGBTQ, whatever it is, it's the most narcissistic ideology that we thought of. And now we are adhering to, celebrating, and now, doing all this craziness. You continue to elevate the self. You continue to build that Tower of Babel. Guess what happens? You know, we know what happens.
Yeah. If you don't read Genesis. Um, we're gonna quickly go to one current event. There is a video clip of Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrews, who is a U.S. Marine Corps sniper, and he is telling Congress in this video clip that was shared on March 8th, telling Congress that he was denied permission to shoot the suicide bomber in Afghanistan that killed 13 service members and over 170 civilians. If we think back to the exit that the U.S. had, the U.S. exit out of Afghanistan, this sergeant was the sniper that knew about the bomber, the suicide bomber that attacked the civilians and service members at the airport. And he was not given permission to shoot this suicide bomber. And he breaks down in his telling of this in front of Congress. And I quote, plain and simple, we were ignored. Our expertise was disregarded. No one was held accountable for our safety. The withdrawal was a catastrophe, in my opinion. There was an inexcusable lack of accountability. He also has suffered injury in that explosion and has lost friends, and has seen people just die in that. It's something that he could have stopped, that he wasn't given permission to do so.
Yeah. I think it's very sad. And as a Christian, I think we should also be very, very sad that this is going on in a nation like ours, where we are the ones that boast of accountability. We are the ones that want to uphold honor. And our motto, literally, from the beginning of our nation was for God and country. And so those are things where we have gone so far from what we initially stood for. And then you see that in the fruit of what is happening, where even the Afghanistan pullout was solely political. It was so political that, you know, our politicians, our leaders could care less about um, the lives that we put on the ground. I feel personally that there is such a disdain for our service members that that's why people feel, at least people feel that. That's why our recruitment is at an all-time low. No one wants to join the army now. No one wants to join the military now. The way our government or nation would treat its service members, if anything, our veterans and our service members should be held in honor. They're the ones that are in the front lines defending our country. So Sergeant Tyler Vargas Andrews is a sniper. And as you've mentioned, he had multiple opportunities and a really long one. I think in his testimony, he had like an hour once of just being able to identify through intelligence this person is a person that is dangerous and was most likely the bomber that killed so many people, and especially the service members. He lost an arm and a leg, and he had like over 100, maybe 100 to 150 pellets in his body that they had to do multiple surgeries for him to get out. And this person, or the sergeant, has not had an opportunity to share his testimony until today, or until a few days ago, rather, which is March 8th of 2023. I remember the Afghanistan pullout was in 2021 in the summer. And so it's been that long. And finally, he's able to share this. No one has been held accountable. No one has been fired, demoted. No one has been charged with this whole debacle. Meaning, they kept on saying, "Can we get a green light for this?" And even their commanding officer said, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we can get it. He go up the chain of command, but no one would give them an answer. So they just sat on this intel, which is which was pivotal, which was life and death,
Yeah.
quite literally.
Yeah.
And so here we are, understanding that when bureaucracy and politicians come into very specific, specialized operations, they will not only muck things up, but it will cost lives.
Mm.
That's what it is. They had to go up the chain of command to who knows where because the politicians wouldn't okay. And they needed to maybe hear it themselves. I don't know. But when you're on the ground, when you're in enemy territory, especially in a crucial time as the withdrawal from Afghanistan, you would have to trust your boots on the ground to a certain degree. You would have to have people who know the area, that have the expertise and the experience to give the commands to, take out a potential bomber that will put so many people's lives at risk. And yet they had to continue to go up the chain and they got stuck with bureaucratic red tape. This is terrible. This is terrible. This is when politics and politicians believe that they are gods and kings, and this is a religion that people want to adhere to. I'm not sure why people want bigger government when you see things like this. I think there was a very famous quote, I forget by whom, that was saying, if you want big government, just go to the DMV and try to get something from the DMV.
Yeah.
Do you want something? Do you want more of this? No, that was the quote. Do you want more of this? I think the reason why we have talents and God-given roles, specialties, is because all of the body is important. We can't assume that, one area or one specific place holds, all sovereignty and power and dominion over every area of life. And this is why, I think not just big government, but the biggest government is inherently unbiblical. So meaning the bigger government you get to, it just invariably goes down the tubes, and you're going to go to unbiblical grounds. And you can't have that. Now, I'm not saying you have no government. I'm not saying we should be libertarians. I don't agree with that either. And like we talked about in the podcast, we have God-given governmental roles, right? Like we read in Romans. And so those are things that the government should have. Beyond that scope, you are going to go into totalitarianism and things like that. And so those are things that we ought to watch out for. This is why we want wisdom. But going back to Sergeant Vargas Andrews' testimony, I think it's incredibly sad. And it should make you feel sick to your stomach that we've had to experience this because of the muck up by government agencies going all the way up to the chain of command. Ultimately, our commander in chief being responsible. The buck should stop there always. And so it can't go beyond that. And I think that's something that we should always keep in mind in our prayers when we pray for the repentance of our nation. The more our nation does not repent, we see things like this happen more and more.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Dear Church podcast. Join us next week as we will have a discussion on laziness and the sins of the tongue. Join us next week. This is going to be fun. People are going to be angry after that one too, but it's a good anger. Tune in next week to find out. We hope and pray that this has been a blessing in your ears. Fight the good fight, finish the race, keep the faith. Peace.